This too, how have animals impacted society? So those early communities have continued to develop and continued to move into what we see now as both urban and agriculture regions. So the first thing I want to define when we talk about society is this idea of developed versus developing nations, and understanding that the agriculture needs and the agriculture production systems are very different depending on the type of infrastructure you're going to see in that nation. So when we talk about developed countries, that would be the United States. So it's a sovereign state whose economy is very progressed. It has great technological infrastructure. You're going to see things like, ranching, large commercial operations, a lot of mechanized agriculture. And really the goal in developed countries is to make money. So is to make a living off of what they're selling, not just keep themselves from starvation. Developing countries, and this would be like the community that I was in when I was in Africa, is one that does not have a lot of industrialization or technology. So I want you to think of things like maybe not a great sewer system or a trash system. Might have roads, but they're probably dirt and probably not maintained. Maybe don't have access to things like gasoline or oil to run tractors. So really understanding that a lot of times these nations are usually low per capita income, food costs are really high, it's hard to transport and get to food in the first place. And more often than not, we call this subsistence farming, where they're basically just raising food to feed their family. There might be a little extra to share with neighbors or maybe take into town, but more often than not, it's just keeping that family alive. And when we talk about developing versus developed nations, it's really important to understand that these countries really are very different based on the amount of money they spend on food and an agriculture system. So if I look at, Nigeria or Kenya, subsistence farming means you're usually spending about 50% of your income just on food to keep your family alive. And that's very different than somewhere like the United States. Now, that number might be a little higher if we're talking about college students, right? But more often than not, there's not as much food scarcity. Now, that doesn't mean it doesn't exist in the United States, because it does. There are things like food deserts that we have to address in the agriculture industry. But it's things like, I have the option to go get a Starbucks instead of I'm just putting rice and beans on the table. I have the option to, go into and get, really nice gourmet pizza instead of just the cheap pizza that's frozen in a box. And so there's a lot more disposable income in the United States to spend on things like food. And this also contributes to things like calories. So if you look, developed versus developing, we have our different colors here, addressing things like calories and then how many calories come from animal products. And you'll notice developed countries are always higher. They're consuming more calories, and more often than not, they're consuming most of those calories from an animal product. This is also the same when it comes to protein. So developed countries, again, they're getting more access to protein than developing countries, and a lot more of it is coming from animal products. So when we look at both calories and protein together by country, you'll notice that I'm kind of comparing US to Nigeria or developed to developing nations, and that most of those calories from animal products are coming out of developed nations, whereas developing nations often can't afford that type of protein. And same thing with calories. They're consuming more calories, they're consuming more of it from animal products. Now, as disposable income increases, meaning if you have more money, why is it being spent on animal products? And more often than not only do animal-based foods taste good, so things like milk and meat and cheese and different products that we'll see from our different livestock species, but they're very nutritious. So the amount of protein that you would get out of a glass of milk versus a bowl of beans in a developing country is very different. Those are considered really premium products, but the protein value that they have for things like growing kids or different people with illnesses is monumental. And so as we see an increase in disposable income, more often than not, people will be getting their protein from an animal-based source. So let's talk about the importance of agriculture. Now that we kind of understand developing versus developed, we can kind of take it from a global to a local perspective here. Now, the first thing we need to understand about agriculture, and this is on a global level as well as a national level here in the US, is that we have a very sophisticated system of agriculture. So more often than not, we have a grower who's producing the product. So think producing the cows, producing the rice, producing the wheat. And that producer then ships their product to a processor. And during the production phase, they'll have a number of allied industries that will help them produce that product. So things like fertilizer companies, equipment companies, technology companies that would all support that product before it's sent to a processor. Now, once that product is sent to a processor, it's then moved to a distributor. So that product's broken down, put into packaging, and then moved to somebody that might ship it to a place like a Costco or a Walmart or different things like that. Now, the next thing we need to understand that on a global level, society is dependent on agriculture. And when we see the agriculture system go down, we see a major loss of lives. So each one of these incidents is a historical time when we saw the agriculture industry get crippled in a different country. And every single time we saw starvation, we saw lots and lots of lives lost, both from lack of food as well as disease. And so you're going to see things, everything from the potato famine in Ireland in 1845. You're going to see historic droughts in both China and India in the 1800s, where just because of drought conditions or lack of water, they were not producing the products the country needed to feed its people. And then even as late as the 1900s, we saw in Russia, where again, weather, you went from a deep freeze to a lack of water, and we saw over 27 million people starving just from a collapse of the agriculture infrastructure. So one of the big things we need to understand is that countries are run based on food, and that's really where our industry comes in to help feed the different populations around the world. Now, as we talk about society and its approach to agriculture, one of the big things we need to understand is that technology really has led to major changes in the way that we do production in the United States. And we're starting to see this more and more as countries move from developing to developed. And so things like way back when we were still using, horses and plows to work fields, we replaced that with a tractor. And so your modern day tractor right now actually would require 110 horses and 55 worker teams in order to do the same amount of work. So very productive, which is what has allowed us to become more efficient and decrease our food costs here in the United States. And that's involved a lot of mechanization. So a lot of things like tractors and equipment and parts and different technology to kind of work around that. It's led to a lot of innovations. It's led to a lot of research. And so kind of the next big push in agriculture now is how do we become more sustainable? And it's very important to understand that when we look at, this study, this diagram here on the left, milk raised in 2007 compared to 1944 uses 90% less land, 14% less water, and we've reduced the carbon impact by 63%. So it's huge to understand that technology isn't always this bad, terrible thing in industry. It's actually very good and has allowed us to become more sustainable, more efficient, and really helping us create a better environment for animals to be raised in that's not impacting the world or the globe in a negative way. And so again, when we talk about the impacts of technology and we look at just from the early 1900s, so I always think kind of my grandparents, the Great Depression era, up to kind of current modern day production, you're seeing us, raise more animals on less land. And believe it or not, we actually have less animals that we're doing it with. So we've actually decreased the number of cattle we need to get the same product. And this doesn't look like building monster cattle or monster animals, but it really looks at being efficient with things like genetics and nutrition and really being careful about the resources that we utilize in this industry and seeing it impact consumers in a positive way. So when we talk about animal agriculture globally, and we talk about the amount of animals that we see, poultry and cattle and sheep tend to be, as well as ducks, tend to be kind of on the upper end of animals that are produced around the globe. Turkey coming in kind of at the bottom just because it's not as popular. It's usually more related to a United States holiday instead of something else globally. And this really gets us to, okay, if that's the amount of animals we have globally, what do we have here in the United States? So animal agriculture is a global business now. So when different countries are impacted, we see that impact our prices, our ability to ship in, so import, export different products on an animal agriculture basis. And so it's important to understand that when we talk about cattle, cattle, we actually produce a fifth of the world's beef. So a fifth of the entire globe's beef. And we do that with 7% of the cattle. So again, 20% of beef comes from the United States, and we do it with 7% of the cattle in the globe. So we're really getting very efficient at not having as many animals and still being able to produce the same product. And you're going to see us actually have 10% of the world's chickens. We have a large amount of horses and a large amount of turkey in the United States. And that just gets across this idea that those cultural differences of how we handle animals also impacts the amount of animal agriculture we have. So understanding that we have the most of the turkey globally because we have Thanksgiving and we eat most of the turkey. And with an equine, we have about a fifth of the world's population in horses. We don't eat them. We use those for, sport and entertainment and hobbies. And so just understanding that when we talk about animal agriculture, those numbers and those statistics really are important because it starts to impact what do we use the animals for, why do we have them, what's happening, and it's pretty amazing when we talk about how right now in the world we're really going after cows as a problem for the environment. They're a greenhouse gas production system, and then we look at how many horses we have. And horses are never talked about if they have an environmental impact. So just understanding that we have to really have a good overview of this industry to start making decisions about what is sustainable, what is effective, how do we get more productive, how do we get more sustainable, and so on and so forth. So we've already kind of established in the United States that we have cheap food sources, that we're very efficient. But the two other things that I want you to understand is that in the United States, we have some of the highest standards of food safety. We have one of the biggest kind of centers of animal behavior and ethics here in the United States, or standard of living for both humans and animals. This is still something that, again, we have to work at daily to continue to maintain those expectations of ethics and welfare. But the United States is a very, very impressive machine when it comes to agriculture production. Now, California agricultural commodities that you're going to see us kind of be very familiar with here in our state is things like milk and cream. So we're a very, very big producer of raw milk or just wholesale milk. We are a huge producer of almonds, grapes, and then cattle and calves, and then lettuce. And so when we talk about animal agriculture, you won't see as much poultry or swine here in California. More often than not, that's at Foster Farms, which is located in the central part of California, but most of those species are kept more in the southern part of the United States. And then when we talk about California, it tends to be we're raising cows and calves. We're raising dairies that are producing some type of wholesale. We have a really big organic market here in California, and so those are kind of our two top animal products you'll see in California.